There are books that entertain us for an afternoon and books that stay in our memory like a quiet heartbeat. But then there are books that reach out a gentle hand and ask us to look at the world again. That is the kind of power we are dealing with today. Welcome back to Echoes of Books. If you enjoy thoughtful literary journeys, remember to like this video and subscribe. If you feel moved by the end, you can even support the channel and help keep these long-form essays alive. Today we are stepping into the dusty streets and shaded porches of Maycomb to revisit To Kill a Mockingbird. Published in 1960 by Harper Lee, this novel did not simply enter American literature. It arrived like a soft thunderclap. It won the Pulitzer Prize, became a national treasure, and captured generations of readers with its blend of innocence, grief, humor, and moral clarity. It is one of those rare works that belongs to both the classroom and the heart. Harper Lee herself was a fascinating figure. She grew up in Monroeville, a small Alabama town that looked suspiciously like Maycomb. She was childhood friends with Truman Capote, who later became one of the most flamboyant literary voices of the 20th century, while Lee remained private, observant, and insistently modest. She spent years quietly studying law, working airline ticket counters, and writing in the margins of her life until the manuscript that would become To Kill a Mockingbird took shape. After the novel's success, she famously stepped away from the spotlight, a kind of literary Boo Radley in her own right, watching the world from behind a screen door. But what she left us is a novel that continues to influence legal ethics, school curricula, civil rights conversations, and the imagination of millions. Let us begin with a line from the book that is echoed far beyond its pages. You never really understand a person until you climb into their skin and walk around in it. It is a simple sentence spoken by a quiet father to his curious daughter, but it carries the entire weight of the novel. It is the compass that guides every emotional turn in the chapters that follow. To Kill a Mockingbird is often described as a story about justice. But before it is about justice, it is about seeing the people we assume we know, seeing the truths we try to ignore, seeing the world from a vantage point we could not imagine on our own. And somehow, Harper Lee wraps all of this inside the voice of a little girl with overalls, a quick temper, and a heart wide enough to fit the whole town. So as we settle in together today, take a moment to like this video if you enjoy this kind of slow, deep reading. It helps the channel more than you know. And if you want to support Echoes of Books, check the description for ways to contribute. For now, all you need to do is sit back, breathe with the rhythm of the story, and let us step into Maycomb. If you close your eyes for a moment and imagine a small southern town during the 1930s, you might picture something like Maycomb. The air feels slow enough to touch. The sidewalks bake in the summer sun. The porches are the center of every conversation, and the gossip moves through the town as naturally as the breeze. This is the world where our narrator, Jean-Louise Finch, better known as Scout, begins her story. She looks back on her childhood with a mixture of affection and disbelief, the way adults often remember a time when life felt simpler, but the shadows stretch longer than they realized. Scout is 6 when the story truly begins. She is small, fierce, and allergic to anything resembling the expectations placed on girls of her age. Her hair refuses to stay neat, her dresses itch, and she often solves arguments with her fists before her brain catches up. She grows up with her older brother, Jem, who is just old enough to believe he understands the world, but just young enough to still misjudge it. Their father, Atticus Finch, is the calm center of the household. He's a lawyer who reads quietly in the evenings, never raises his voice, and carries a kind of steady moral warmth that Scout does not yet have the vocabulary to describe. Later, she will understand it as integrity. At this point in her life, it mostly feels like an unshakable kindness. And of course, there is Dill, little Dill Harris, who arrives in Maycomb each summer like a gust of curiosity. He is imaginative, energetic, talkative, and sees the world with the dramatic flair of a boy who hopes to be a writer someday. He is based on Harper Lee's real childhood friend, Truman Capote, who shared that same fragile boldness. Together, the three children spend their summers in a kind of innocent conspiracy against boredom. They tell stories, build fantasies, and invent games, but nothing fascinates them more than the mysterious house at the end of the street, the Radley place. The Radley house sits under the shade of a sweeping oak tree and looks permanently startled, as if no one has touched its windows or opened its shutters in decades. Inside lives Arthur Radley, whom the children call Boo. The rumors surrounding him are so fantastical that even the adults of the town half believe them. People claim he only comes out at night. They claim he stabbed his father with scissors. They claim his face is as white as flour and his eyes glow in the dark. None of these rumors are true, but for the children, Boo becomes the epicenter of imagination. The house is both frightening and magnetic. It is the mystery that pulls them deeper into the world. But just as these childhood adventures begin to form a rhythm, something shifts in the adult world that Scout and Jem have barely noticed until now. Their father, Atticus, is appointed to defend a man named Tom Robinson, a black field worker accused of assaulting a white woman, Mayella Ewell. What happens next is not loud at first. Prejudice rarely arrives with fireworks. It begins with whispers in grocery stores, tight smiles on the sidewalk, the kind of careful distance people keep when they think you have broken some unspoken rule. Scout notices adults using a word she has never heard before, directed at her father. She's too young to understand it, but she can feel its poison. Jem feels it too. Dill, being Dill, hears it and immediately wants to fight someone about it. It becomes clear quickly that Tom Robinson is innocent. The evidence is thin, contradictory, and even absurd. Atticus can see this. Many people in the courtroom can see it. But the society of Maycomb has been built on an invisible architecture of segregation and fear. And in a place where skin color dictates status, the truth has to fight for its life. The courtroom scenes in the novel are some of the most memorable in American literature. Imagine the room so full that people sit in the aisles. Imagine the heat so thick it clings to the walls. Imagine the entire town holding its breath, waiting for Atticus to stand up for a man they have already condemned in their minds. When Atticus delivers his closing argument, the silence is so complete that you can almost hear the dust settling. He says, "In this country, our courts are the great levelers. In our courts, all men are created equal." Those words ripple through the crowd, but they cannot change a verdict shaped long before the trial began. The jury finds Tom Robinson guilty. It does not matter that the accusations make no sense, that the evidence contradicts itself, or that Mayella's story reveals more about her loneliness than Tom's guilt. The system chooses the narrative it has always chosen. And Jem, who believed so fiercely in justice, feels something inside him crack. Scout sees it happen. A boy learning that fairness is not guaranteed is a difficult thing to witness. It is even harder when you are his younger sister and you feel the same disappointment blooming inside you. After the trial, Tom attempts to escape prison and is shot. The news falls on the town with a dull, heavy weight. Some people shrug, others shake their heads. Atticus carries the grief quietly, as he carries most things, but Scout notices that his shoulders seem just a little more tired. This is where the story could have ended, but Harper Lee brings us back to where it all began. Boo Radley, the quiet figure who has lingered on the edges of the story the whole time. Bob Ewell, Mayella's father, is furious that Atticus exposed his lies during the trial. He begins to lash out at those who embarrassed him. One night, when Scout and Jem are walking home from a school event, he attacks them. It happens quickly, without warning, in the darkness of a rural road. Jem is injured. Scout is trapped inside her costume. And then something impossible happens. A figure emerges from the shadows and pulls them to safety. It is Boo, the ghost of the street, the whispered rumor, the man the town has judged for years without ever offering kindness. He is nothing like the monster the children imagined. He is shy, gentle, almost fragile. He stands in the corner of the Finch house like someone who does not want to disturb the air. And when Scout finally takes his hand, she realizes something profound. Boo Radley has been watching them with quiet affection all along, leaving them small gifts in a tree, laughing softly when their footsteps ran past the porch, protecting them without asking for recognition. Scout walks him home. She stands on Boo's porch and looks out over the street. For the first time in her life, she sees the world the way Boo sees it, from a distance, with tenderness and sorrow. She understands her father's lesson. You never really know a person until you step into their skin and walk around in it. The story closes on that image, a child learning compassion not through sermons but through experience. This is not just a plot summary. It is the heartbeat of the novel. A story that begins with curiosity, deepens with injustice, and ends with understanding. It shows us the world as a child sees it and as an adult remembers it. And in that gap between memory and truth, something powerful grows. Internal mechanics, narrative design and structure. When you peel back the layers of To Kill a Mockingbird, you discover something quietly astonishing about the way Harper Lee built this novel. On the surface, it feels like a simple recollection of childhood. A girl tells us how she grew up in a small town. Her memories move with the looseness of summer dust, carrying us from schoolyards to porches to old trees and streets filled with cicadas. But beneath that surface, there is an architecture so deliberate that you can feel its emotional weight even if you cannot name it. The story is holding two worlds at once, and the movement between them is the true engine of the novel. The first world is the realm of children. The second is the reality of adults. And Harper Lee treats them almost like two different continents that slowly drift toward each other until the collision becomes inevitable. Think about the early chapters. They wander in a way that feels almost musical. Scout fights with classmates, Jem climbs trees, Dill invents stories about Boo Radley that are so dramatic, they should come with theme music. If you read these chapters without knowing what is coming, you might think the entire novel will be a gentle memoir of childhood. It has that comforting glow, the kind where memories soften their edges. But even in these early pages, there is a quiet murmuring in the background. Something is waiting in the tall grass. Scout narrates everything with a kind of bright confusion that only a child can produce. She understands things literally and emotionally at the same time, which is one of the reasons readers fall in love with her voice. She asks questions that adults avoid. She repeats things adults whisper. She hears slurs before she fully grasps their meaning. Her world is wide open, and Harper Lee uses that openness as a narrative gateway. It pulls us into Maycomb with innocence while preparing us for the shadows beneath the sunlight. This is where the genius of the structure unfolds. In many novels about justice, the trial comes near the end or forms the clear central act of a traditional rise and fall. But in To Kill a Mockingbird, the trial does something subtler and more intimate. It does not appear suddenly. It begins as a rumor, a conversation overheard, a curious glance between adults. It gathers mass the way storms do in the South, slowly, quietly, then all at once. By the time Scout and Jem walk into the courtroom gallery, we have crossed a long emotional bridge. We have left childhood behind without realizing we took the steps. What Harper Lee understands is that childhood is not a separate chapter of life. It bleeds into adulthood, and the novel mirrors that truth. All the impressions Scout gathers before the trial become the emotional groundwork for what comes after. We know the street. We know the porch. We know the dusty summers. We know the neighbors, their strengths, their meanness, their habits, their secrets. So when the trial erupts into the center of the story, it does not feel like a plot twist. It feels like a truth that has been living under the surface from the first page. One of the most striking structural choices is how the trial, despite being the dramatic core, is not the end of the story. Most courtroom narratives finish with a verdict and let the aftershock echo in the reader's imagination. Harper Lee does the opposite. She lets the verdict stand, then quietly leads us back into the rhythms of town life. Back to the schoolyard, back to the porch, back to night walks. But nothing is the same. The shape of the world has changed and the children can feel it in their bones. This post-trial sequence is where the real emotional gravity lies. Jem is shaken in a way he cannot articulate. Scout is searching to make sense of the contradiction between the moral world she believed in and the world she now faces. Atticus moves with the same calm grace as before, but there is a faint heaviness in him, as if the fight he took on has taken something from him. And the town itself seems to shift positions, like the furniture in an old house settling unevenly after years of pressure. Then the story makes its final structural turn. It circles back to Boo Radley. The man who was once a childish obsession becomes the silent answer to the emotional question the trial leaves behind. Who is truly dangerous in this town and who is merely misunderstood? What does fear look like, and what does kindness look like when stripped of reputation? Harper Lee saves Boo until the end because he is the emotional key that locks both halves of the story together. Boo belongs to the world of childish myths, but also to the world of adult moral truth. He carries the softness of one and the sorrow of the other. The structure of the novel is therefore a slow and steady collapsing of distance. Childhood moves toward adulthood. Imagination moves toward reality. Fear moves toward understanding. And Scout moves toward that final moment when she stands on Boo's porch and narrates the world as he would see it. It is a structural gesture, a quiet closing of the circle. She began the story looking at Boo's house from the outside. She ends the story from the inside looking out. What makes this structure so powerful is not its complexity, but its emotional precision. It mirrors the way we grow up. We start with small adventures. We stumble into frightening truths. We confront the limits of fairness. And one day, if we are lucky, we learn to see another person not as a rumor, but as a human being. The novel's structure is less a plot outline and more a moral arc. It teaches us to see before it teaches us to judge. And in that sense, the structure becomes the story itself, symbolism and motifs, the quiet language beneath the story. If the narrative structure of To Kill a Mockingbird works like the skeleton of the novel, then the symbolism is its bloodstream. Harper Lee never over-explains her images. She allows them to hover gently around the story like the southern heat, subtle but impossible to ignore. They move through the scenes like little ghosts carrying meaning. And when you slow down and listen to the rhythms of the novel, these symbols begin to speak. Let us start with the Mockingbird itself, the heart of the title and the moral pulse of the book. In the Finch household, the mockingbird is described as a creature that does nothing but sing for others. It harms no one, steals nothing, and asks for nothing in return. So when Atticus tells Scout that it is a sin to kill a mockingbird, he is not simply giving her a rule of ethics. He is teaching her a way of seeing. He is saying there are people in this world whose only crime is existing with gentleness, and harming them is one of the great moral failures. The mockingbird becomes a symbol that stretches its wings across multiple characters. Tom Robinson is the obvious one. He tries to help Mayella Ewell out of simple kindness, yet that kindness becomes the weapon used to destroy him. His innocence is not just ignored, it is punished. And the pain of that truth lingers long after the verdict is delivered. But the novel does something more delicate with this symbol. It suggests that Boo Radley is also a mockingbird. He lives quietly, avoids confrontation, and for years is the subject of cruel rumors. He gives gifts in the knot of a tree, watches over the children during their walk home, and finally risks everything to protect them from Bob Ewell. Boo has never harmed anyone, yet the town treats him like a phantom, a danger, a superstition. When Scout finally understands that dragging Boo into the spotlight after he saves their lives would be like killing a mockingbird, the symbol completes its gentle arc. It is not about innocence alone. It is about the moral responsibility to protect innocence wherever it exists. Another important motif is the Radley house. At first glance, it looks like nothing more than the spooky house every town remembers from childhood, the one you cross the street to avoid. But look again, and you will see how Harper Lee uses it as a mirror, reflecting the anxieties of the whole community. The Radley house is wrapped in silence, but the silence is never its own. It is filled with the projections of everyone else. Adults whisper stories about Boo. Children invent frightening scenarios. The house becomes a container for the town's fears, not an actual reflection of Boo's character. In this sense, the Radley house represents the power of myth over truth. It shows how a community can decide what a person is without ever meeting them. The Radley house is a symbol of how isolation can warp into legend, how ignorance becomes narrative, and how narrative becomes fear. The tree outside the Radley place carries its own subtle symbolic language. In its knothole, Scout and Jem find small treasures left for them by someone they cannot see. The items are simple: a couple of carved dolls, a pocket watch, chewing gum, trinkets that would mean nothing to adults but are magical to children. The knothole becomes a secret channel of communication between worlds. It is Boo's way of reaching across the boundary others have built around him. But when his brother fills the knothole with cement, it is one of the most painful moments in the novel. Jem cries, not because of the cement itself, but because something tender has been cut off. A gesture of connection has been sealed shut. This moment symbolizes how fear destroys communication and how cruelty often hides behind the excuse of tradition or propriety. Another symbol worth exploring is the mad dog that Atticus shoots in the street. At first glance, it is a practical episode. A rabid dog is dangerous and must be put down. But look closer and the scene becomes an allegory. The dog stumbles through Maycomb like an image of irrational hatred, blind to everything but destruction. Atticus, who hates using a gun and has not fired one in 30 years, is the one who must stop it. It is not a coincidence that this scene occurs just before the trial begins. The mad dog symbolizes the type of prejudice that infects a community. It is wild and unpredictable, yet people often convince themselves it is harmless until it is right in their path. Atticus shooting the dog is a symbolic foreshadowing. He's about to face the rabid force of racial hatred in the courtroom. But unlike the dog, he cannot stop it with a single shot. He must confront it with reason in a world that does not want to listen. Clothing, too, becomes a motif in the novel, especially when it comes to Scout. She is constantly pressured to wear dresses by Aunt Alexandra, who believes that respectability is stitched into the fabric of a hemline. Scout wants none of it. She prefers overalls, loose and practical, the uniform of a child who wants to move freely. This tension between attire and identity mirrors the larger battle between society's rigid expectations and a child's honest sense of self. When Scout attends the school pageant dressed as a ham, the giant costume makes her clumsy, but it also saves her life by absorbing Bob Ewell's attack. The irony is beautiful and telling. The same community that tries to mold her into one version of femininity ends up saving her through a ridiculous costume that protects her from violence. Clothing in the novel reflects the pressures and contradictions imposed by society. Light and darkness also weave symbolic threads through the story. The trial scenes are harshly lit. Every detail is exposed. The truth is clear, but the truth is not enough. Meanwhile, Boo Radley's world exists in shadows. He steps into the light only at the end, and even then, the light is gentle, from the lamp of the Finch living room. Scout later describes him as pale but benevolent, almost glowing. This interplay between light and shadow reflects the shifting nature of truth. Some truths must be dragged into the light. Others must be approached softly, with compassion, in the dim spaces where vulnerability hides. Finally, the courthouse itself stands as a symbol of both justice and injustice. Its columns and rafters suggest dignity, yet the seating arrangement tells another story. White citizens sit downstairs. Black citizens are pushed to the balcony. Even before the trial begins, the architecture declares the verdict. The courthouse is a physical manifestation of the social order. It pretends to uphold equality, but its design betrays the truth. Harper Lee understands that buildings, like people, tell stories whether they mean to or not. Each of these symbols supports a larger theme: innocence punished, fear misinterpreted as danger, kindness silenced, prejudice disguised as normalcy, truth overlooked because of tradition. These symbols are not loud. They whisper. They wait for the reader to linger a moment longer before moving on. That is Harper Lee's brilliance. She does not need to explain the symbols. She lets them move naturally through the scenes, carried by the characters' interactions and the unspoken tensions of the town. When readers return to Kill a Mockingbird after years away, they often tell the same story. They say they noticed something new this time, a line they missed, a moment they never thought twice about as a teenager. That is the power of a novel built on quiet symbols. It grows with you. It does not change, but you do. And as you change, the symbols catch the light differently, revealing corners you did not see before, voice and style. The child's eye and the adult's memory. One of the most extraordinary things about To Kill a Mockingbird is not just what Harper Lee tells, but how she tells it. The entire novel flows through a single narrative voice, yet that voice has two layers, almost like two musicians playing the same melody on different instruments. One is the child Scout, the girl who sees everything firsthand. The other is the adult Jean-Louise, who looks back at those memories with tenderness, embarrassment, and a slow dawning awareness of what truly happened. The result is a voice that feels intimate, witty, slightly chaotic, unfiltered, but also wise in a way only hindsight can allow. It is the voice of someone remembering childhood not to escape adulthood, but to understand it. Scout's voice is the first thing that wins us over. She speaks with a sincerity that borders on fearless. When she recounts her early fights at school, she does not sugarcoat anything. She simply says what she saw and how she reacted, the way children do when they have not yet learned the art of social softening. She describes people with blunt honesty. She repeats things adults say without grasping the weight of their words. She asks questions that cut through pretense. And she narrates moments that feel light-hearted on the surface, but ache with meaning underneath. Her voice has the texture of childhood, curious, brave, occasionally confused, and always in motion. Child narration can easily become sentimental or precious, but Harper Lee avoids that trap because Scout is not a perfect child. She is clever but stubborn, sweet but often defiant. She misreads situations. She lashes out. She is shaped by her environment, but also questions it instinctively. Her flaws give her voice authenticity. And because of that authenticity, readers trust her even when she does not yet understand the world she is describing. But hovering above Scout's perspective is the voice of the adult. It is never heavy-handed, never intruding loudly, but present in the small hesitations of the narration. You can feel it in the sentences where Scout recalls something that confused her at the time, but now carries deeper meaning. For instance, when she repeats Atticus's advice about climbing into someone's skin and walking around in it, She relays it with the seriousness of a child hearing a command from a trusted parent. But you can sense that the adult narrator is guiding us to understand that this is not just a father soothing a child. It is the thematic compass of the entire novel. That layering of understanding makes the novel resonate with both young and adult readers. Children see one world, adults see another. And the beauty lies in how Harper Lee weaves the two without ever breaking the illusion. The style itself is deceptively simple. Lee's sentences rarely draw attention to themselves. They flow like conversation, the kind you might have while rocking on a porch swing with a glass of something cold in your hand. But that simplicity is a craft. She writes in a way that feels natural, but if you listen closely, the rhythm is incredibly controlled. Scout often jumps from one observation to the next, yet the transitions feel organic because they mimic the associative thinking of childhood. Harper Lee allows Scout's mind to wander, but always gently pulls the reader back toward the emotional center. There are moments when Scout's innocence becomes a kind of spotlight, showing the absurdity of adult behavior. When she overhears adults discussing the trial using words she cannot define, the innocence of her confusion reveals the ugliness beneath their politeness. When she describes Aunt Alexandra's missionary group, the adult voices politely lamenting the plight of distant cultures while ignoring the suffering of their own neighbors. Scout's literal perspective turns into satire without her ever intending it. Lee uses the child's voice as a mirror, reflecting the contradictions of society back at the reader. The adult narrator adds a second dimension to these moments. She never steps in with a heavy explanation. Instead, she lets the irony speak for itself. This restraint is part of the novel's style. Harper Lee trusts the reader to catch the implications behind the lightly comic scenes. There is a quiet confidence in that. The novel invites us to participate in making meaning. It does not tell us how to feel. It shows us. And that showing is done through language that feels as effortless as breath. Lee also uses humor in a way that enriches the emotional landscape. Scout's observations are often funny not because she tries to make jokes, but because she takes the world at face value. When she describes Miss Caroline, the new school teacher from the North, who has absolutely no idea how Southern children speak or behave, the humor grows from the clash between Scout's expectations and Miss Caroline's rules. Scout narrates the awkwardness with disarming honesty. The humor becomes a relief valve because the novel is preparing to move into heavier territory. Without these moments of levity, the story might feel unbearably heavy. Instead, it becomes deeply human. Another important aspect of the narrative voice is its pacing. The early chapters move with the unhurried rhythm of long summer afternoons. You can almost feel the humidity in the air, the drone of insects, the slow turning of time. Then, as the trial approaches, the rhythm tightens. Dialogue becomes more pointed. The scenes grow more focused. The pace quickens without losing its reflective tone. It shifts the emotional temperature of the novel, preparing the reader for the confrontation ahead. The courtroom scenes are stylistically different in a subtle way. Scout is still the narrator, but her tone becomes more observant. She understands that something important is happening, even if she does not grasp every detail. Harper Lee uses the courtroom as a spotlight for language. Lawyers speak in measured phrases. Witnesses give fragmented testimonies. The judge tries to maintain order. The diction becomes sharper. The tempo increases. The tension is encoded in the cadence of the sentences. Scout becomes a lens through which the adult world is magnified. Her voice filters the complexity without flattening it. That is one of the most impressive achievements of the novel's style. After the trial, the tone softens again, but the softness is different now. It carries the weight of disillusionment. Jem's heartbreak seeps into Scout's narration. Atticus's weariness appears in the margins. The voice is the same, but something inside it has shifted. Scout is still Scout, but she is beginning to see the world without the protective layer of childhood innocence. And Harper Lee lets that emotional transformation appear naturally in the language. Sentences feel slightly heavier. Reflections linger longer. Wonder becomes tinged with awareness. The final chapters, with Boo Radley stepping into the story, reveal the full power of the dual narrative voice. Scout describes Boo with the awe of a child encountering something magical, yet the adult narrator gives the moment an emotional clarity that childhood could not provide. When Scout stands on Boo's porch and says she never really saw the street properly until she saw it from his point of view, the voice becomes a bridge. The child is speaking, but the adult is remembering, and the two versions of Scout merge. It is one of the most beautiful uses of narrative perspective in 20th century fiction. This layered voice achieves something rare. It allows readers to experience the story the way we experience our own memories. We remember childhood with a blend of vividness and incompleteness. We recall details with surprising clarity, but interpret them with the wisdom, regret, and tenderness that come only with age. Harper Lee captures that duality perfectly. The novel is not just about a young girl learning to understand the world. It is about an adult revisiting the moments that shaped her capacity for empathy. When we talk about voice in literature, we often speak technically: point of view, diction, tone. But the voice in To Kill a Mockingbird is not technical. It is emotional. It carries us. It holds our hand. It lets us feel what it was like to be young in a town filled with contradictions. And then, without warning, it reminds us of what it feels like to grow older and realize those contradictions shape the lives of real people. This is the voice that makes the novel unforgettable. Not grand statements and not rhetorical flourishes. A child telling us what she saw. An adult remembering why it mattered. And somewhere between those two voices, the truth of the story emerges: character psychology. What drives them and how they change. To Kill a Mockingbird is often praised for its themes, its message, its elegant structure, and its lyrical voice. But none of that would matter if the characters did not breathe, falter, and ache, and grow in ways that feel painfully real. Harper Lee writes people the way most of us remember those who shaped our childhood. Not perfect, not flat, but living contradictions. They try, they fail, they surprise us, and they disappoint us. And sometimes they teach us truths that arrive softly but stay forever. Let us begin with Scout, because she is our doorway into the story. Scout is one of those narrators who seems simple until you look again and realize she is carrying the entire emotional weight of the novel on her small shoulders. She begins the story as a fiercely independent child who wants nothing more than to climb trees, read whatever she pleases, and fight anyone who insults her father. In a different book, she might have been a comic side character, but here she becomes a living compass of curiosity. Her mind is wired to question the world. She never accepts things simply because adults say them. When a teacher reprimands her for already knowing how to read, her confusion is not just childlike. It reflects a deeper truth about how society often punishes natural intelligence when it disrupts tradition. Scout's early misunderstandings create small moments of comedy, but they are always wrapped in something deeper. For instance, when she hears adults whispering certain words or sees neighbors reacting with discomfort when they discuss Tom Robinson, she senses something wrong long before she understands it. That sensitivity is part of her personality. She absorbs emotional temperature instinctively. She notices contradictions. She feels sincerity. And even though she cannot articulate injustice yet, her body reacts to it through confusion or anger or an unnamed sadness. Her psychological journey is not dramatic, but slow and organic. It is the journey from wondering to recognizing, from reacting to understanding, from fighting physically to thinking morally. Jem, on the other hand, travels a darker emotional path. If Scout is the bright spark of the story, Jem is the quiet bruising underneath it. At the beginning, he is full of impulsive confidence. He thinks he knows how the world works. He is proud of floating above childish fears. He lectures Scout about bravery. He makes bold decisions. He tries to imitate Atticus's calm demeanor, even though he is not yet old enough to understand the discipline it requires. Jem seems on the verge of becoming a small Atticus in training, but the trial breaks something inside him. The verdict against Tom Robinson is not just disappointing for Jem, it is shattering. He had believed in the fairness of the world the way children believe in gravity. He trusted that if you tell the truth and present the evidence clearly, justice will prevail. When the opposite happens, Jem experiences something adults rarely mention, but most of us know well. He experiences moral grief. The grief of realizing that rightness does not always win. That people will choose cruelty even when the truth is placed directly in front of them. That the world is not arranged according to fairness. Jem's heartbreak is one of the quiet triumphs of the novel. Harper Lee does not dramatize it. She lets it unfold in side glances, short conversations, restless evenings. She lets it live in his silence. And Scout, who loves him deeply, senses his internal shift without understanding its full significance until much later. Jem becomes a symbol of innocence lost not through personal wrongdoing, but through witnessing the wrongdoing of others. Then there is Atticus Finch, the character who has inspired generations of lawyers, teachers, and readers. People often describe Atticus as the moral hero of the novel, but that label flattens him. Atticus is not a superhero. He is not flawless. He is not an idealist who believes he can transform society with a single speech. Atticus is something more subtle and much more human. He is someone who chooses to live by his values even when he knows the cost. Psychologically, Atticus is a fascinating blend of restraint and quiet courage. He understands people more deeply than they understand themselves, yet he rarely uses that understanding for judgment. When he tells Scout that you never truly understand a person until you stand in their skin, he is teaching her the rule he follows every single day. It is why he stays calm when Bob Ewell spits in his face. It is why he defends Tom Robinson even though he knows the town will scorn him for it. It is why he treats even the most unpleasant characters with courtesy. Atticus's form of bravery is not loud. It is a lifetime of small, consistent decisions to uphold dignity. There is also a subtle sadness in Atticus. Despite his intelligence and compassion, he knows his limits. He knows the trial is unwinnable. He knows the roots of prejudice run deeper than one man's efforts. When he says to Scout that they were licked 100 years before they started, it is not a surrender. It is a simple statement about the long shadow of history. Yet even with this knowledge, he chooses to stand in that courtroom and offer his best defense, not because he expects victory, but because moral action is not measured by outcomes alone. For Atticus, the act of trying is its own form of integrity. Now let us speak of Boo Radley, the character who hides in plain sight. Boo is one of the great mysteries of the novel, not because he is elusive, but because the town refuses to see him. Much of what people think they know about Boo is fiction, woven from gossip, fear, and imagination. Even Scout and Jem, for all their innocence, construct elaborate myths around him. But when Boo finally steps into the light, he becomes one of the most tender characters in the book. Boo's psychology is shaped by isolation. He has lived behind the walls of his home for so long that the outside world must feel overwhelming. Yet instead of bitterness, he carries a kind of gentle watchfulness. He communicates through small acts, leaving gifts in the tree, mending Jem's torn pants and folding them neatly, following the children from a distance when they walk home after dark. Boo expresses affection silently, like someone who has learned that speaking invites misunderstanding. When he saves the children from Bob Ewell's attack, It is not sudden heroism, but the natural extension of years spent caring for them from afar. Boo is a portrait of kindness that exists outside the gaze of society. A reminder that the people judged most harshly are sometimes the ones who love the most quietly. Tom Robinson's psychology is shaped by a different kind of isolation. Tom knows the world will not listen to him, yet he still tries to speak the truth. He knows the system is designed against him, yet he still agrees to testify because he believes in the possibility of decency. His kindness to Mayella Ewell is genuine, born from compassion for a lonely young woman trying to manage a household of children without help. But that same kindness becomes the basis of the accusation that destroys him. Tom's story reveals how deeply the world punishes vulnerability when it appears in the wrong skin. When Tom attempts to escape from prison and is shot 17 times, the brutality of the act says everything about how fear and prejudice distort justice. His death is the deepest wound in the novel, and the grief of it lingers even in the final chapters. There are other characters whose psychological presence is just as meaningful, even if they occupy fewer pages. Mayella Ewell, for example, is a tragic figure. She is trapped in a home ruled by fear and poverty. She cares for her siblings with no mother to guide her. She has no friends. She's desperate for kindness. Mayella's loneliness becomes a kind of psychological hunger, and when Tom shows her compassion, she mistakes it for affection. Her accusation is not born purely from malice, but from terror. She fears her father more than she fears the truth. Her testimony is filled with contradictions because she is fighting a war inside herself. When Atticus gently calls her Miss Mayella and she flinches at the rare courtesy, the moment is so painful that some readers overlook it. But it reveals everything about her interior life. Even Bob Ewell, as hateful as he is, reflects something psychologically true. He is a man who clings to the only form of power available to him. In a rigid social hierarchy, Bob sits near the bottom. The only thing that places him above anyone else is the color of his skin. When Atticus exposes his lies, Bob experiences that exposure as an existential threat. He lashes out in the only way he knows: violence, humiliation, vengeance. It does not excuse him. It simply makes him a recognizable product of anger and insecurity. When you gather all of these characters together, their psychology forms the emotional architecture of the novel. Scout symbolizes curiosity and the slow dawning of empathy. Jem symbolizes the heartbreak of growing up. Atticus symbolizes the steady light of conscience. Boo symbolizes misunderstood goodness. Tom symbolizes the cruelty of a world structured by injustice. Mayella symbolizes the tragedy of fear and loneliness. Bob symbolizes the destructive force of pride and rage. What makes To Kill a Mockingbird unforgettable is not just that these characters exist, but that they change us. We walk with them. We ache with them. We see ourselves in them. And in doing so, we understand why Harper Lee's novel continues to resonate across generations. The psychology of its characters reveals the psychology of human nature itself. Historical and cultural context, America's uneasy mirror. To Kill a Mockingbird is often read as a story floating inside the safe, amber glow of memory. But the truth is that the world behind this novel is not soft at all. It is shaped by hard lines, political tremors, and a deep moral tension that ran through America long before Harper Lee ever set pen to paper. To understand the meaning of the book, you have to understand the world that built it. And the world that built it was complicated, contradictory, and unbearably human. Harper Lee set her story in the 1930s, during the Great Depression, but she wrote it in the 1950s, a time when America was beginning to confront the long shadow of segregation. Those 2 decades sit on top of each other like 2 layers of heat, slowly pressing against one another until the air becomes too heavy to ignore. The 1930s gave the novel its texture: dusty roads, failing farms, a rigid hierarchy of class and race, and a small town where everyone knows every whisper. The 1950s gave it urgency, The civil rights movement was gaining strength. Old structures were cracking. New voices were rising. And readers were beginning to ask questions that previous generations had quietly avoided. Maycomb, the fictional town, reflects a particular kind of Southern rhythm. Time moves slowly there. It is almost suspiciously calm, as if the quiet itself is trying to hide something. People take pride in family lineage and often cling to tradition with a kind of stubborn affection. But underneath the politeness and porch swings lies a racial order that has been enforced for centuries. Even the youngest children in Maycomb understand where they are allowed to go and where they are not. They understand which families sit at which places in the social ladder. They absorb these invisible rules the way one absorbs humidity, without noticing it until it becomes overwhelming. It is important to remember that when Harper Lee published her novel in 1960, many towns in the American South looked painfully similar to Maycomb. Schools were still segregated. Buses were still segregated. Voting rights were still not truly accessible for Black citizens. And in some counties, juries rarely acquitted a Black man accused by a white woman, regardless of the evidence. Harper Lee did not invent these tensions. She held up a mirror, and the reflection was unsettling enough that some readers saw themselves in it and flinched. Harper Lee had a personal understanding of this world because she lived in it. She grew up in Monroeville, Alabama, a place small enough to fit inside the imagination of Maycomb. Her father was a lawyer, much like Atticus, and he once defended Black clients in a case that deeply affected the young Lee. She witnessed how fear, gossip, pride, and tradition shaped the decisions of an entire community. She saw how prejudice wears ordinary faces and speaks in polite tones, and she felt how difficult it was for anyone to stand against it. Yet Harper Lee's relationship to the South was not one of disdain. She loved it. She loved its storytelling, its neighborly rituals, its small-town oddities. But she also saw its wounds. To Kill a Mockingbird is written with affection, but the affection is not blind. It is the affection of someone who knows the flaws as intimately as the beauty. The novel carries both love and disappointment, woven together like a bittersweet kind of honesty. The 1950s added another layer to this emotional charge. When Lee was writing, events like the Montgomery bus boycott and the desegregation of public schools had pushed racial injustice into national headlines. Harper Lee was drafting a story that looked backward but was speaking directly to the present. That is one reason the novel became so powerful in American classrooms. It gave young readers a way to understand the world they were living in without confronting that world too abruptly. They could look at Maycomb and see their own communities reflected back at them. Let us consider the architecture of Maycomb more closely. The class hierarchy is rigid, but it is also unstable. Families like the Cunninghams live with dignity and hardship. Families like the Ewells live with poverty and bitterness. And below all these groups lies the Black community, whose lives are described with both respect and sorrow. They form the backbone of the town's labor and the heart of its church gatherings, yet they are denied basic rights. Scout describes their church service as honest and spirited, with hymns that rise without hymn books because not everyone can read. The absence of books is not a symbol of ignorance. It is a symbol of exclusion. Literacy was historically withheld from Black Southerners to maintain the structures of inequality. Harper Lee does not blare these truths through megaphones. She whispers them through scenes of daily life. The social boundaries show up in classroom seating, in courtroom balconies, in conversations beside fences. The racism of Maycomb is not loud until it has to be. It is often delivered through quiet remarks and subtle expressions. This is historically accurate. Structural prejudice in many American towns operated not through constant violence, but through a network of small, unchallenged assumptions. The danger is not always in the threats. It is in the complacency. This is the world Tom Robinson steps into the moment he enters the courtroom. He is a black man accused of harming a white woman during a time when such an accusation could destroy his life instantly. It did not matter that the evidence pointed to his innocence. It did not matter that Mayella Ewell's testimony trembled with contradictions. What mattered was the racial script of the 1930s South, a script written long before Tom Robinson was born. And Harper Lee places us in that courtroom not to shock us, but to show us how normal injustice had become. The lines between fiction and reality blur even more when we consider how the civil rights movement embraced the novel. Teachers used it in classrooms to open conversations about empathy. Ministers quoted Atticus in sermons. Young readers wrote letters to Harper Lee thanking her for giving them a language for what they had felt but could not express. The novel became a cultural bridge. It allowed people to approach painful truths from the safe distance of a story. Yet the book's historical reception is also paradoxical. While many praised its courage, others criticized its limitations. Some argued that Harper Lee portrayed racism through the lens of white characters, centering Scout and Atticus, rather than giving deeper voice to Tom Robinson's world. This criticism arises partly from the historical moment. In 1960, white liberals were beginning to confront segregation, but their narratives often relied on white characters to mediate the story of racial injustice. Harper Lee reflects that tension. Her novel advocates compassion for Black Americans while telling the story through a white family. This does not diminish the novel's impact, but it does contextualize it. To Kill a Mockingbird is both a challenge to injustice and a product of its time. Even the smaller details of Maycomb fit neatly into the historical context. Consider the role of sheriffs in small southern towns. Their authority often blended legal duty with personal relationships. When Sheriff Tate decides not to expose Boo Radley after the attack on Scout and Jem, his decision is not based on formal justice, but on community loyalty and compassion. This reflects the South's tradition of personal morality intersecting with legal roles. Sometimes the right choice was not the official one. Consider also the role of churches and community gatherings. The Black church in the novel welcomes Scout and Jem with warm hospitality, even though it is the one place in town where they truly understand they are guests. The white missionary circle, in contrast, expresses sympathy for distant people in faraway countries while ignoring the suffering of their Black neighbors. These contrasts mirror real cultural dynamics in the South during the early 20th century. Churches were often the safest spaces for Black community leadership and often the most resistant spaces to change for white congregations. Harper Lee also captures the slow cultural rhythm of a town where nothing seems to change until everything changes at once. The trial is a hinge moment, not just in the plot, but in the cultural psychology of Maycomb. It forces everyone to reveal who they truly are. Some respond with courage, others with hostility, and many with silence. Silence is its own historical note. Silence was one of the great forces that allowed segregation to persist. People who saw injustice often remained quiet, not because they agreed with it, but because they feared disrupting the fragile peace of the community. Harper Lee captures this hesitation with painful accuracy. To Kill a Mockingbird therefore functions as a historical novel, not just because of its setting, but because of its insight. It understands the emotional landscape of the South. It understands how communities rely on tradition even when tradition harms them. And it understands the weight of stepping outside the roles that society assigns you. When Atticus defends Tom Robinson, he's not just making a legal argument. He's taking a public stance that challenges the very foundation of Maycomb's social order. And in 1930s Alabama, that was not just unusual, it was dangerous. The novel bridges two eras, the era it depicts and the era in which it was written. That bridge gives it an unusual clarity, the way a person standing between two mirrors can see infinitely in both directions. One mirror reflects a past shaped by segregation, insecurity, and the quiet cruelty of unspoken rules. The other reflects a future where those rules are beginning to crack, challenged by courage, protest, and a generation demanding more. This dual vision is what makes the novel more than a memory. It is an uneasy mirror held up to America, one that still reflects more than we often want to admit. And perhaps that is why To Kill a Mockingbird continues to feel alive today. Its history is not finished, its lessons are not resolved, and its questions still linger in the spaces where justice and tradition meet, philosophical undercurrents, courage, empathy, and the ethics of seeing. There are novels that try to teach you something by placing a moral lesson right in the center of the page. And then there are novels that whisper philosophy through the smallest gestures, the quietest silences, and the way one character looks at another character across a room. To Kill a Mockingbird belongs to the second category. It is a philosophical novel not because it quotes philosophers, but because it behaves like one. It asks questions without insisting on answers. It shows the consequences of choices rather than giving lectures about them. And somewhere within that soft Southern voice lies a set of ideas as powerful as any, written by the great thinkers of the 20th century. If you listen carefully, the first philosophical thread running through the novel is a form of gentle existentialism. Not the cold, hard, night at 3 a.m. kind of existentialism that Kafka might give you, but a humble, everyday version of it. The kind that whispers you are responsible for what you choose even when you cannot change the world around you. Atticus embodies this idea. He knows he cannot fix Maycomb. He knows that defending Tom Robinson will not dismantle centuries of prejudice. Yet he takes the case because a person must live with themselves longer than they live with anyone else. In that sense, Atticus represents the existential belief that the meaning of life is shaped by action rather than outcome. What you do defines who you are, even when doing it will cost you. Atticus's quiet resolve might remind some readers of a Stoic philosopher. He practices patience as if it were a daily discipline. He chooses calm even when provoked. He reacts to insults with dignity. He treats children with seriousness and adults with compassion. And the extraordinary thing is that he is not performing virtue. He is simply living it. Stoicism teaches that courage is not the absence of fear, but the ability to act correctly, despite fear. Atticus embodies this without calling attention to it. When he sits outside Tom Robinson's jail cell at night, reading under the street lamp while the men from Old Sarum gather around him, he's not being heroic. He is being responsible. He is showing his children what courage looks like when stripped of drama. Sometimes courage is simply refusing to move. But the novel's most powerful philosophical idea is empathy. Not as a pretty slogan, not as a decorative moral, but as a survival skill, the kind that keeps people humane during times of deep division. The entire book is built around the challenge of seeing the world from another person's vantage point. It is not a coincidence that the most quoted line in the novel is Atticus, telling Scout that you never really understand a man until you climb into his skin and walk around in it. This idea appears over and over in the narrative, often in moments of tension. Scout practicing empathy when she meets her teacher from the north. Jem trying to understand the quiet sadness of their reclusive neighbor. Even the moment when Scout innocently diffuses a potential lynch mob by speaking to Mr. Cunningham about his son is a philosophical argument in practice. It shows that recognizing another person's humanity can interrupt violence, even when that recognition comes from a child who has no idea she is doing something remarkable. This philosophy of empathy is not sentimental in the novel. Harper Lee never pretends it is easy. Empathy reveals painful truths. When Scout begins to understand Boo Radley, she also begins to understand how cruel people can be without realizing it. When Jem grasps the injustice of Tom Robinson's verdict, empathy becomes a burden that rests on his shoulders, heavier than anything he has carried before. Harper Lee suggests that learning to empathize is part of growing up. but she also shows that it hurts. It requires giving up the illusion that the world is fair. It demands that we stop imagining strangers as monsters and start imagining them as versions of ourselves. There is another philosophical current running quietly beneath the surface, and that is the novel's reflection on the difference between legal justice and moral justice. The courtroom is the place where these two ideas collide. The law, in theory, promises fairness, but in practice, it is shaped by the beliefs of the people who enforce it. When Atticus makes his closing argument, he appeals to the idea that the courtroom should be a place where all men are created equal. He wants the jury to see Tom Robinson as a man rather than a symbol. But the jury sees only the rules of the racial hierarchy that they have learned since birth. This conflict between legal truth and moral truth becomes one of the novel's most enduring questions. What good is a system built on fairness when the people inside it refuse to see fairly? The novel also brushes against a quiet form of social philosophy. It examines how a community teaches its members what is acceptable and what is not. Maycomb is a small town, but its unwritten rules are mighty. You do not cross certain boundaries. You do not challenge certain beliefs. You do not disrupt the illusion of harmony. When someone does challenge these unwritten rules, the community reacts not with gratitude, but with suspicion. Atticus becomes a target, not because he is wrong, but because he is disrupting the order that people have used to make sense of their world. Harper Lee reveals that communities sometimes cling to toxic beliefs not because they are proud of them, but because they are afraid of what will happen if those beliefs fall apart. If you look closely, Boo Radley's storyline also carries a philosophical lesson, one that feels almost mythic. Boo represents the danger of judging others based on fear. He also represents the possibility of quiet redemption. In philosophy, there is an idea that the unknown often becomes a repository for human projections. We project danger onto the dark. We project mystery onto silence. Boo Radley becomes the canvas for Maycomb's anxieties. The town paints him as a monster because it needs a monster. But when he finally steps out of the shadows, Boo is so gentle that Scout nearly cries. His presence reminds us that the things we fear are not always the things we should fear. Sometimes, the greatest danger comes from people who look respectable, not from the ones who look strange. And then there is Tom Robinson, whose story contains one of the deepest philosophical reflections in the novel. Tom's tragedy reveals the fragility of goodness when it confronts a system built on cruelty. Tom does nothing wrong. He acts with compassion. He helps Mayella with her chores out of kindness. But in a world where his identity carries more weight than his actions, goodness becomes vulnerability. Harper Lee is not commenting simply on racism. She is commenting on a larger truth. A society that fails to protect its most vulnerable members is a society that cannot call itself moral. This is a philosophical critique, quietly embedded in the narrative rather than announced from a lectern. Another philosophical layer appears in the novel's treatment of memory. The entire story is told through recollection. The adult Jean-Louise looks back at her childhood with both nostalgia and pain. This act of remembering is itself a form of philosophy. Memory becomes a tool for understanding not just the events of her past, but the person she has become. The novel suggests that memory shapes identity. It is in remembering these events that Scout comes to understand her own moral inheritance. The past is not something she outgrows. It is something she carries with her, a private archive of lessons learned. Finally, the novel's ending offers a philosophical resolution. When Scout stands on Boo Radley's porch and sees the world from his point of view, the novel completes its philosophical arc. Everything the story has whispered about empathy, vision, childhood, loss, and moral courage comes together in that quiet moment. Scout imagines Boo seeing the children running past his house, laughing in the yard, growing, changing. She imagines him caring for them secretly. She imagines his loneliness. And with that imaginative act, she bridges the gap between fear and understanding. That is the novel's ultimate philosophy: to see others as human, to recognize their interior world as real, to understand that moral vision is not something we are born with. It is something we learn by looking again. Reception and Controversy, a beloved, disputed classic. If the life of a novel ended the moment it reached the final page, To Kill a Mockingbird would be a closed story. But literature does not work that way. A book continues to live in the minds of readers, and sometimes the life it has after publication becomes as dramatic as the story printed inside it. Few novels have experienced a reception as complex, as tender, as divisive, and as evolving as this one. The world has spent more than 6 decades talking about To Kill a Mockingbird, and the conversation never truly settles because the book speaks to something deep and unsettled within society. When the novel first appeared in 1960, critics welcomed it with an almost relieved admiration. Here was a book that felt gentle enough to read in an afternoon, yet brave enough to push readers toward uncomfortable truths. Many early reviewers praised Harper Lee for capturing the innocence of childhood while exposing the cruelty of racism. Some called it a new Southern classic. Others compared it to the works of Mark Twain, noting that Scout carried a spark of Huck Finn's curiosity, but with a deeper emotional intelligence. Teachers adopted it. Libraries showcased it. Families passed it around. It became one of those rare books that crossed generational boundaries, a shared story that a grandmother, a mother, and a grandson could discuss together. But as the novel settled into literary history, its reception began to shift in ways that reveal as much about society as about the book itself. To Kill a Mockingbird became required reading in American schools, which meant students encountered it whether they wanted to or not. And as happens with many widely taught books, new readers brought new perspectives, and those perspectives were sometimes sharply critical. One of the earliest and most enduring points of controversy revolves around Atticus Finch. For decades, readers viewed Atticus as a near-perfect symbol of moral clarity, a man who stands for justice in a town determined to ignore it. Many law students cited him as the reason they pursued a legal career. Some lawyers still keep a framed picture of Gregory Peck as Atticus in their office, as if the fictional character has become a mentor guiding the practice of real law. But with time, scholars began to ask harder questions. They asked why the story of racial injustice was told through the eyes of white protagonists. They asked why the moral hero was not a black character who had experienced oppression firsthand. They asked whether Atticus's gentleness was truly progressive or whether it was simply the most comfortable version of allyship for white readers. Some critics argued that Atticus, for all his goodness, accepts the social order too easily. He insists on treating every person with respect, which is admirable. But he also believes that change should come through patience rather than confrontation. He does not join activism. He does not challenge segregation directly. He takes a stand for Tom Robinson, not because he wants to reform society, but because he believes in individual dignity. This is noble, but it is not revolutionary. And in the wake of the civil rights movement, some readers found this moral stance insufficient. They wanted heroes who fought harder, louder, and more urgently. Another major controversy concerns the representation of black characters. Some critics argue that while Harper Lee portrays the black community with respect and sympathy, she gives them little narrative agency. Tom Robinson is central to the story, but we see him mostly through the Finch family's eyes. Calpurnia plays a vital role in Scout's life, but we rarely see her outside the Finch home. This absence of interiority becomes a point of debate. Readers ask whether the novel unintentionally reinforces the idea that black suffering exists primarily to teach white characters lessons about empathy. Others counter this criticism by pointing out the constraints of Scout's narrative perspective. Because she is a child, she sees only what a child would be allowed to see. The truth likely lies somewhere in between. The novel both humanizes and restricts its black characters. It offers compassion but not full narrative ownership. That tension is part of why the novel remains deeply discussed instead of comfortably praised. The controversies do not stop there, because To Kill a Mockingbird uses racial slurs and historically accurate dialogue. Many schools have faced debates over whether the book should remain in the curriculum. Some parents argue that reading the novel causes emotional harm to Black students. Others insist that removing the novel erases the historical reality of racism. Teachers often find themselves navigating these tensions with great care. The book becomes not just a story, but a catalyst for contemporary discussions about race, education, and the responsibilities of literature. Interestingly, as the political climate in America has changed, the novel's reception has changed with it. In recent years, some communities that once defended the novel now challenge it, and some communities that once criticized the novel now defend its place. The book has become a litmus test for broader cultural questions about identity, justice, and history. It is no longer simply a literary work. It is a cultural conversation in the shape of a story. The novel's reception also includes a more personal dimension. Readers often describe their first experience with To Kill a Mockingbird in deeply emotional terms. Some say the book was the first time they realized adults can be wrong. Others say it introduced them to the idea of moral courage. Some say that Scout taught them how to see people with more tenderness. And many say that the book changed how they understood their own childhood. Literature rarely receives such intimate testimony unless it touches something essential. One of the most interesting parts of the novel's reception is how different generations interpret Scout. Older readers sometimes view her as a symbol of lost innocence. Younger readers often admire her defiance and independence. Some readers focus on her curiosity, others on her humor. And nearly all of them feel a sense of protectiveness toward her, as though she were a real child who lived down the street. This shows how deeply Harper Lee succeeded in creating a narrator who breathes beyond the boundaries of fiction. Then there is the relationship between readers and Boo Radley. For some readers, Boo represents the fear of the unknown. For others, he represents the tenderness that hides behind shyness. Some see Boo as a metaphor for all the people the world misunderstands. And some readers, especially those who felt overlooked or isolated in their own childhoods, find Boo to be the emotional touchstone of the entire novel. Different interpretations do not cancel each other out. They coexist, each one a reflection of the reader's personal history. Tom Robinson, Atticus, too, inspires varied emotional responses. Some readers see him as the moral center of the story. Others see him as the tragic example of a system that crushes innocence. Some see him as a symbol of every injustice that goes unnoticed. And many readers, especially those who have studied legal history, recognize his story as painfully realistic. Tom Robinson's fate mirrors countless real cases from the early 20th century, and that connection deepens the novel's emotional charge. Even Atticus, the figure once held almost sacred, has a reception history that has shifted dramatically. Early readers saw him as heroic. Later readers questioned his limitations. Some now read him with nostalgia, others with skepticism. Yet the fact that Atticus continues to provoke discussion is a sign of the novel's enduring vitality. Characters who become symbols tend to fade. Characters who spark debates tend to last. The release of Go Set a Watchman in 2015 intensified these debates. That novel, published controversially and drafted earlier than Mockingbird, portrays an older Atticus with views far more conservative and uncomfortable than the Atticus readers had long admired. Some readers felt betrayed. Others felt that the contradictions added depth to the character. Some scholars argued that Watchmen should not be considered a sequel at all, but rather an early draft that Harper Lee never intended to publish. Regardless, the conversation reignited, showing that Atticus's symbolic weight in American culture was far from settled. Beyond literary criticism, To To Kill a Mockingbird has influenced countless adaptations. The 1962 film starring Gregory Peck became a cinematic touchstone, and Peck's performance shaped public perception of Atticus for generations. The Broadway adaptation written by Aaron Sorkin offered a more contemporary interpretation, giving certain characters more agency and shifting the tone toward modern sensibilities. These adaptations show that the novel is not a fixed artifact. It evolves with every storyteller who tries to bring it to life again. Through all of this, one thing becomes clear. To Kill a Mockingbird is not universally loved nor universally critiqued. It is both. It is a book that comforts and disturbs, that inspires and frustrates, that creates nostalgia and forces confrontation. And that is precisely why it remains alive in the cultural imagination. A book without tension dies quickly. A book with emotional and moral friction stays open for interpretation, debate, and rediscovery. The reception history of To Kill a Mockingbird reveals that literature is never static. A novel is shaped not just by the writer, but by every reader who picks it up, every era that reinterprets it, and every conversation that unfolds in its shadow. The story of Scout and Jem and Atticus and Tom and Boo keeps expanding because the questions they raise still echo in our world. And as long as society continues to wrestle with truth, justice, and empathy, readers will continue to argue about what this novel means. Intertextual threads, the quiet conversations with other stories. Every great novel speaks to other novels, even when it never says so aloud. Literature is a long chain of echoes, and To Kill a Mockingbird stands right in the middle of that chain, quietly absorbing the voices that came before it and sending its own voice forward into the future. Harper Lee never wrote this book as an academic exercise. She did not pepper it with references or intellectual winks. And yet, when you listen closely, the story vibrates with intertextual energy. It carries the fingerprints of Southern Gothic tradition, the moral humor of Mark Twain, the courtroom rhythms that later shaped modern legal fiction, and even distant echoes from classical fable and folklore. To understand how Harper Lee weaves these connections, let us begin with the most obvious influence, the Southern Gothic tradition. Readers familiar with William Faulkner will feel the kinship almost immediately. A quiet town with hidden violence, a decaying social order that everyone pretends is stable, a community that cannot escape its past. These themes hum under the surface of To Kill a Mockingbird. But unlike Faulkner, whose stories often plunge deep into madness and despair, Harper Lee takes the same oppressive landscape and filters it through the eyes of a child. She keeps the shadows, but she lets the light in, which is perhaps why this novel resonates with such a broad audience. It allows readers to face the darkness without being swallowed by it. Another important influence is the tradition of American storytelling shaped by Mark Twain. Many readers compare Scout to Huck Finn, and the comparison is not accidental. Both children are sharp observers. Both speak with a wit that unintentionally exposes adult hypocrisy. Both wander through worlds shaped by prejudice that they do not fully understand but instinctively recognize as wrong. But there is a key difference. Huck runs away from society. Scout grows up inside it. Huck rejects the world. Scout tries to understand it. Huck's journey is a rebellion. Scout's journey is an awakening. And that subtle contrast shows how Harper Lee is in conversation with Twain while also creating something of her own. The courtroom scenes in To Kill a Mockingbird also belong to a long lineage of American trial narratives. Before Harper Lee, writers like Melville and Hawthorne used public judgment as a symbolic theme, often exploring how societies enforce moral codes. After Harper Lee, courtroom drama exploded into an entire genre. John Grisham's legal thrillers, the television series Law and Order, and even true crime documentaries all inherit something from the stark drama of Tom Robinson's trial. The courtroom becomes a stage where truth battles perception, where rules collide with biases, and where justice is not guaranteed by procedure, but shaped by the people in the room. Harper Lee's version of this stage is quieter than the thrilling, fast-paced dramas that followed, but it is precisely that quietness that makes it timeless. She shows the stillness before injustice falls. She shows the soft spaces where a verdict becomes a wound. The novel also echoes folklore and biblical stories, not through explicit retellings, but through symbolic resonance. Boo Radley is, in many ways, the archetypal misunderstood figure hidden behind myth. He represents the ancient idea that people fear what they do not understand. In folklore, the forest at the edge of the village always holds something unknown. In this novel, the Radley house becomes that forest. Children tell stories about it. Adults whisper about it. And yet, when the truth emerges, Boo is revealed not as a creature of danger, but as one of the most gentle presences in the story. This inversion of the monster myth is an old narrative tradition used to teach empathy through surprise. Harper Lee modernizes it, humanizes it, and roots it in the psychology of a small southern town. There is also the faint echo of the fable in the novel's moral arc. The mockingbird itself feels like a symbol lifted from an ancient tale, a creature that sings without harming anyone, a creature whose beauty lies in its harmlessness. The idea that killing such a creature is a sin belongs to a long tradition of stories where the innocent symbolize the fragile goodness of the world. In some sense, the mockingbird motif feels like the novel's attempt to create a new fable for the modern age, one that replaces mythical beasts with real human beings. If we look forward instead of backward, the intertextual influence of To Kill a Mockingbird on later literature and media becomes even more striking. The novel shaped the cultural imagination of generations of writers. Many coming-of-age stories featuring child narrators owe a debt to Scout's voice. You can feel her influence in novels like The Secret Life of Bees or The Book Thief, where children interpret adult injustice through their own emotional lenses. Even contemporary young adult fiction, which places moral questions in the hands of youthful protagonists, draws on Harper Lee's structure without always realizing it. The themes of the novel also echo through books that engage directly with racial injustice. For example, Bryan Stevenson's nonfiction work Just Mercy deals with wrongful convictions in Alabama decades after the time of Tom Robinson. The emotional resonance is immediate. The reader realizes that the past is not past. The injustices that destroyed Tom Robinson's life have transformed but not disappeared. Modern writers confronting these issues often acknowledge Harper Lee as part of the cultural groundwork that allowed such narratives to gain mainstream attention. In theater, Aaron Sorkin's adaptation introduces another intertextual layer. Sorkin places emphasis on dialogue, moral argument, and the tension between law and conscience. His version of Atticus is sharper, more conflicted, more visibly emotional. Some viewers love this reinterpretation. Others prefer the quiet, unshakable Atticus of the novel. But regardless of opinion, the adaptation is proof that this story is flexible. It can be reframed, it can be reinterpreted, it can be handed from one storyteller to another, like a melody that sounds different when played on a new instrument. The film adaptation starring Gregory Peck is another powerful part of the novel's intertextual life. Peck's performance shaped the public image of Atticus so strongly that some readers now imagine him when reading the book. His calm voice, his gentle strength, his compassionate dignity all contributed to the mythologizing of Atticus. The film also preserved the novel in the cultural memory of millions who might never have read the book. In many ways, it created a second layer of storytelling, one that fused with the original. Even television and video games have carried echoes of the novel's themes. Any story that explores small-town dynamics, moral courage, or the innocence of childhood colliding with harsh social realities owes something to Mockingbird. Modern narratives like Life is Strange or Night in the Woods carry faint thematic DNA from the emotional arcs of Scout and Gem. The idea of a young protagonist learning that adults are not always right, that justice is not always real, and that compassion requires courage has become a narrative cornerstone across mediums. It is also fascinating to consider how the novel's intertextuality changes when read by different audiences. Readers from the American South often recognize the cultural texture intimately. Readers from outside the United States may connect more strongly with its universal themes of prejudice and growth. Scholars of classical literature may trace its moral reasoning to ancient ethics. Scholars of social justice may trace its relevance to protest movements of the 20th and 21st centuries. The novel is like a prism. What you see in it depends on where you stand. Intertextuality is not just about influence, it is also about conversation. To Kill a Mockingbird speaks with authors long gone and authors yet to come. It speaks with voices from folklore, from courtroom dramas, from childhood adventures, and from the philosophical meditations of ethical thinkers. It absorbs all these echoes and sends out new ones. And yet, Harper Lee does not try to imitate anyone. She writes with her own voice, her own softness, her own blend of humor and gravity. The intertextual conversation flows naturally because she is writing about truths that many writers before and after her have also wrestled with. Perhaps that is the secret. To Kill a Mockingbird feels both familiar and original because it taps into narrative patterns older than itself. The innocent child confronting a flawed world. The misunderstood figure revealed as gentle. The just man facing a corrupt society. The scapegoat punished without cause. The silent hero who never asks for recognition. These are archetypes that have walked through mythology, theater, scripture, folklore, and modern storytelling alike. Harper Lee did not invent them, but she gave them new life in a specific American context. And in doing so, she created a novel that reads like a timeless story wearing the clothes of the 1930s. To Kill a Mockingbird is not merely a novel that stands alone. It stands in conversation. It listens to the past, speaks to the present, and whispers into the future. That is intertextuality in its most organic form. A story that recognizes it is part of a longer human journey, philosophical undercurrents, what the novel says about being human. If you strip To Kill a Mockingbird down to its bones, past the courtroom drama, past the small-town gossip, past the nostalgic glow of childhood summers, you end up with something much quieter and far more profound, a meditation on what it means to be human in a world that constantly asks us to choose between who we are and who we want to be. Philosophy is not something Harper Lee announces on the page. She never stops the story to deliver a lecture. She never uses overt metaphors or dramatic epiphanies. Instead, she does something far more elegant. She lets philosophy seep into the corners of the narrative the way evening light seeps through the curtains, softly, slowly, and suddenly you realize the room has changed. Let's begin with the most central philosophical idea in the novel: moral courage. Atticus Finch embodies a form of courage rooted not in action, but in conviction. He stands for truth in a world that punishes people who stand too tall. But Atticus does not fit easily into traditional categories of courage. He is not a warrior. He is not a reformer. He does not seek victory. He simply holds his ground, believing that integrity is a kind of compass that remains useful even when you can't change the direction of the wind. This idea echoes ancient Stoicism. The Stoics taught that you cannot control outcomes. You cannot force justice. You cannot dictate how others behave. The only thing you control is the self, your response, your speech, your choices. This is Atticus distilled, a man who cannot win the trial, who knows he cannot win the trial, but who fights because the act of fighting aligns with his understanding of what it means to live a decent life. But Harper Lee complicates Stoicism in subtle ways. Stoicism can become passive if taken too literally. It can become an excuse for inaction. Atticus's critics argue precisely this, that he is too calm, too patient, too willing to let the world move on its own schedule. And this tension between moral clarity and moral urgency becomes one of the book's most enduring philosophical debates. Should goodness be gentle? Should justice be polite? Is it enough to be principled? Or must you also be disruptive? These are questions that the modern world continues to wrestle with, and they give the novel a philosophical weight far beyond its setting. The second major philosophical current is empathy. Atticus tells Scout, "You never really understand a person until you consider things from his point of view." The simplicity of that sentence disguises its difficulty. Empathy is not just imagination. It is moral labor. It requires setting aside your own assumptions, your own comfort, your own certainty. It requires stepping into a world that may argue against your own. And here lies the paradox. Harper Lee presents empathy as both a personal virtue and a societal failure. Scout learns empathy quickly. Jem learns it painfully. Atticus practices it as a discipline. Boo Radley lives it without speaking. But the town of Maycomb, the adults, the jurors, the established powers, refuses it entirely. So what do we do with a philosophy that works beautifully on the scale of family, but collapses on the scale of society? The novel does not answer this, but it forces us to sit with the question. From here, we move to the third philosophical layer, innocence and experience. Scout begins in innocence, not ignorance, but innocence, the kind that seeks explanation rather than defense. Throughout the novel, she tries to reconcile what she sees with what she knows to be good. The trial breaks this innocence, not because she sees evil for the first time, but because she realizes that adults will defend evil if it protects their world. This echoes the philosophy of childhood explored in works like Rousseau's Emile, where innocence is not a state to be escaped, but a state to be preserved for as long as possible. Harper Lee does not idealize innocence, but she does value it. Innocence allows Scout to see with clarity what adults excuse. Innocence cuts through rationalizations. Innocence sees the mockingbird as simply a creature that sings. And then there is Boo Radley, who complicates the entire philosophical structure of innocence. Boo is both a child and an adult, both vulnerable and wise, both afraid and brave. His innocence is not naivety. It is survival. He embodies another philosophical idea often overlooked in discussions of the novel, the ethics of care. Care ethics argues that morality is relational. We are good not because we follow rules, but because we choose compassion in concrete situations. Boo's final act is the perfect expression of care ethics. He does not act out of ideology. He does not act out of principle. He acts out of love for the children who unknowingly loved him back. This brings us to a fourth philosophical theme, the problem of the good person in a flawed society. Harper Lee does not create perfect characters. Even her best figures fail in meaningful ways. Atticus fails to protect Tom. Heck Tate fails to arrest the real threat. The community fails its most vulnerable members. The lesson is not that goodness is useless, but that goodness exists inside a structure shaped by fear, tradition, and silence. This is where the novel taps into existential philosophy, particularly the idea that moral action must exist even in the face of absurdity or hopelessness. The verdict is unjust. The system is corrupt. The town is entrenched. But people still choose. They still act. They still carry one another home in the dark. In that sense, the novel's moral universe is existential with a soft landing. The world is flawed, but human beings still matter. The fifth philosophical thread is the question of storytelling itself. To Kill a Mockingbird is a story told by an adult recalling childhood. This creates a space where memory becomes a philosophical tool. The grown scout interprets the past with a mixture of affection and pain. She does not lie about what she saw, but she understands it differently now. Memory in this novel is not nostalgia. It is perspective. It is the ability to return to events that once felt confusing and recognize their true shape. This aligns with the idea that wisdom is not the accumulation of facts, but the reinterpretation of experience. Harper Lee suggests that to grow up is not to replace one truth with another, but to hold multiple truths at once: innocence and understanding, love and disappointment, hope and grief. We also cannot ignore the philosophical tension between justice and mercy. The final moral dilemma in the novel revolves around the question of whether Boo Radley should be exposed as Bob Ewell's killer. The legal system says yes. Justice demands transparency. But Hecate and Atticus ultimately choose mercy. They choose protection over procedure. They choose human dignity over legal consistency. This moment challenges the traditional notion of justice as impartial and universal. It suggests a more nuanced idea. Justice must consider context. Justice must consider intention. Justice must consider harm. And sometimes justice must bend to protect the vulnerable. This is a radical idea, especially in a novel that begins with the assertion that the law should protect everyone equally. By the end, we understand that the law is not neutral. And Harper Lee quietly argues that morality must sometimes intervene where the law fails to see clearly. Finally, and perhaps most subtly, Harper Lee introduces the philosophy of the mockingbird itself. The mockingbird symbolizes innocence, beauty, and the quiet gifts that individuals bring to the world without harming anyone. But the deeper meaning is this: the world often destroys what is harmless simply because it can. Tom Robinson is a mockingbird. Boo Radley is a mockingbird. And so is every person who tries to live kindly in a world that rewards cruelty. The philosophy here is bittersweet. Humanity is capable of gentleness, but also capable of crushing gentleness without a second thought. The mockingbird reminds us of the fragility of goodness and the responsibility to protect it. These philosophical currents weave through the novel like unseen rivers. They do not interrupt the story. They shape it quietly. They rise beneath Scout's childhood observations, beneath Atticus's calm speeches, beneath Boo's silent gestures. And when the novel ends, we realize that Harper Lee wasn't writing a story about a trial. She was writing a story about conscience, about the struggle between who we are taught to be and who we choose to become, about the kind of courage that whispers rather than shouts, about the painful beauty of growing up in a world that cannot always be explained. The philosophy of To Kill a Mockingbird is not a puzzle to be solved. It is a landscape to be walked. And like Scout on Boo Radley's porch, the longer you stand in that landscape, the more clearly you begin to see the world, language, style, and narrative architecture, how the story speaks. When readers try to explain why To Kill a Mockingbird feels so alive, so intimate, and so strangely comforting even when it breaks our hearts, they often point to the plot or the characters or the themes. But the real magic sits in the writing itself, the voice, the rhythm, the quiet humor, the soft ache woven into every line. Harper Lee didn't just tell a story. She built a narrative architecture so gentle and so deceptively simple that many people forget how technically ambitious it is. To understand the novel's inner mechanics, we need to examine how it speaks, the choices that give the book its emotional warmth, its moral clarity, and its unmistakable sense of place. Let's start with the narrator. Scout Finch is one of the trickiest narrative designs in American literature because she is both child and adult at the same time. The I telling the story is a grown woman, remembering her childhood. But the voice telling the story often feels like the child herself, curious, blunt, unfiltered, and refreshingly honest. This dual perspective is a feat of narrative engineering. When Scout describes events from her childhood, she uses the vocabulary and innocence of a young girl who is trying her best to understand the adult world. But when the grown narrator occasionally steps in, she adds a layer of reflection that deepens the meaning without breaking the illusion of youth. The result is a voice that sees everything and understands only part of it, which is exactly where the emotion lies. Scout notices details the adults overlook. She repeats things she doesn't yet comprehend. She misreads expressions, misinterprets silences, and mislabels tensions. And through these misunderstandings, we see the truth more clearly than if it were laid out directly. This is narrative irony at its most tender. The reader is always half a step ahead of Scout emotionally, and yet we never feel superior to her. Instead, we feel protective. We see the cracks in the world she has not yet learned to name. Harper Lee's use of humor also deserves attention. It is not the loud, comedic kind. It is gentle irony, subtle contrast, the kind of humor that comes from watching a child attempt to understand the inscrutable rituals of adulthood. Scout's confusion around Miss Caroline, Jem's dramatic theories about Boo Radley, Dill's imagination running wild like a small playwright. These moments lighten the novel without trivializing its core issues. The humor is not decoration, it is structure. It gives the story room to breathe. It cushions the arrival of darker scenes. It creates emotional rhythm, light, dark, wonder, fear, curiosity, sorrow. A rhythm that mirrors childhood itself. Harper Lee also uses symbolic motifs with extreme restraint. She is not a writer who points neon arrows at her metaphors. Instead, symbols emerge naturally from the world, like objects lying in the road waiting for Scout to notice. The oak tree's knothole is a perfect example. It is a symbol, yes. Connection, communication, hope squeezed through cracks in silence, but Harper Lee never announces it as such. It lives inside the story as casually as a toy chest or a front porch swing. And because it feels real, its emotional meaning hits harder when the hole is cemented shut. Another example is the Mockingbird motif itself. Harper Lee introduces it through Atticus's quiet wisdom. It is a harmless creature, a singer, a giver. But she doesn't employ it as a blunt metaphor. She trusts the reader to connect Boo, Tom, and even Scout's fleeting glimpses of innocence with the idea of the mockingbird, a life that harms no one, and yet is vulnerable to destruction. The novel's descriptive language also carries weight. Maycomb breathes. It is sleepy, slow, worn, warm. Time moves like syrup in the summer heat. The dust rises gently. The porches creak. The sidewalks crack with weeds. People move with an ease that is both charming and unsettling. This atmosphere is not just scenic. It supports the novel's moral architecture. The town's languid pace parallels its moral inertia. People resist change because they have all the time in the world, and because time never seems to bring consequences for those who need them most. Harper Lee's dialogue, too, has its own truth. It is crisp but grounded, polite but edged, Southern but not caricatured. She writes the way real people speak when they think they are being polite, which is often when they're being the most evasive or unkind. The rhythm of the prose expands during calm scenes and contracts tightly during intense ones. Notice how the sentences shorten during the trial, how the pacing quickens, how the courtroom's stifling atmosphere is reflected in clipped exchanges and understated gestures. Harper Lee doesn't flood the moment with melodrama. She trusts silence. She trusts the quiet cracking of Jem's disbelief, the soft tap of Atticus's shoes, the stillness of the balcony as the verdict is read. It is minimalism with maximum emotional pull. The structure of the novel also deserves attention. On the surface, it seems like a blend of vignettes, childhood episodes loosely tied together. But underneath those episodes lies a narrative architecture built around gradual disillusionment. The first half of the book gives us the world as Scout sees it: playful, mysterious, mischievous. The second half gives us the world as Scout must learn to see it: complex, unfair, dangerous, deeply flawed. The transition between these halves is not a sudden shift. It is a slow accumulation of experiences that chip away at childhood's protective shell. Scout's understanding evolves not through a single revelation, but through layered encounters with injustice, cruelty, and unexpected kindness. This is a crucial part of the novel's emotional truth. Growing up is not a moment. It is a series of small, quiet awakenings. Another element of style that often goes unnoticed is Harper Lee's use of contrasts: light and shadow, innocence and violence, whispered myths and harsh truths, children's games and adults' prejudices, warmth inside the Finch home and the coldness of the courthouse. These contrasts create a visual texture that mirrors the emotional contradictions of life in Maycomb, a town that prides itself on civility while hiding its cruelties in plain sight. Harper Lee uses these contrasts not to accuse the town, but to portray it honestly. She allows contradictions to exist without forcing resolution. She lets characters be both kind and cruel, generous and closed-minded, humble and prideful. She writes people the way they are. This brings us to an underappreciated aspect of her style: restraint. When Tom Robinson is shot, Harper Lee does not dramatize the moment. She delivers it through the matter-of-fact tone of a local newspaper. When Boo Radley saves the children, she does not wrap the scene in flowery heroism. She keeps it quiet, almost fragile. When Atticus loses the trial, she does not erupt into despair. She lets the weight sit in the silence. Restraint is the novel's emotional signature. It invites readers to feel the ache rather than being told to feel it. The final piece of the novel's stylistic architecture is its moral voice. Harper Lee writes moral clarity without moral perfection. She does not preach. She does not condemn. She does not simplify. She offers a world in which goodness exists side by side with failure, in which justice is not guaranteed but must be pursued anyway, in which compassion is both powerful and insufficient. This moral voice is what gives the novel its timeless quality, not because it presents easy answers, but because it forces us to ask harder questions. What does it mean to do good in a world designed to reward complacency? How do you teach a child about justice when justice fails? How do you protect innocence without lying about the world? How do you stand for what's right when standing won't change anything? Harper Lee doesn't guide us through these questions. She places them in our hands gently, like Scout carrying Boo Radley's arm, and allows us to walk with them for as long as we need. In the end, the novel's language and style achieve something rare. It makes the reader feel seen. Seen in our longing for goodness, seen in our confusion, seen in our contradictions, seen in our small attempts at kindness in a world that often feels too large and too cold. This is why To Kill a Mockingbird remains alive. Not because it is flawless, not because it solves anything, but because it speaks softly to the fragile, hopeful, complicated human being inside each of us, and because it does so through a voice that feels like memory, like truth, like home. Before we close, I want to return to a simple truth. To Kill a Mockingbird is not a perfect book, but it is a true one. True in the way childhood memories are true, soft at the edges, glowing in places, but carrying pain that never fully disappears. It reminds us that beauty and brutality often grow in the same town, sometimes even on the same street, and that growing up means learning to hold both without letting either one consume us. Across this journey, the novel has shown us so much. It teaches empathy without preaching. It reveals injustice without turning suffering into spectacle. It lets us feel the tenderness of a community that can also wound the people who live inside it. And maybe that's why the book refuses to fade. It exists right at the intersection of memory and morality, where stories stop being entertainment and become questions we carry into our own lives. So let me leave you with a question of my own. When you come back to this book as an adult, where do you stand? Do you feel gratitude toward Atticus and the gentleness he represents? Or do you feel a growing awareness of his limits, the soft walls he never dared to push through? And if Scout were telling this story for the first time in 2025, with our world and our challenges, how differently would she tell it? Thank you for spending this time with me. If this exploration gave you something to think about, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if you want more deep dives into the books that shape us, feel free to subscribe, share the video, or suggest the next story we should explore together. Until then, take care and keep reading with both your heart and your questions open.